The year is 1381. England, a kingdom bruised and battered. The Black Death, a grim reaper, had swept across the land barely a generation before, leaving fields untended and villages silenced. Yet the survivors, the peasantry, found themselves not liberated, but shackled anew by the insatiable demands of lords and a crown ever hungry for coin. Daily life was a relentless cycle of toil. From dawn till dusk, the peasant labored, tilling the lord's fields, harvesting his crops, and receiving only a pittance in return. Their homes, hovels of wattle and daub, offered little respite from the harsh realities of their existence. Starvation was always a specter looming, disease a constant companion. The feudal system, a cage of custom and obligation, bound the peasant to the land and to his lord. He was neither free to move nor free to choose his destiny. And above the lord, the king, entangled in a costly war with France, demanded ever more taxes from his already impoverished subjects. And then came the poll tax, a levy on every person, regardless of wealth or status. For the peasant already struggling to survive, it was the final straw. Men like Thomas Bampton, tax collectors with hearts of stone, descended upon the villages, squeezing the last penny from the desperate. In the taverns and fields, whispers of discontent began to spread. The injustice was too great, the burden too heavy. A sense of desperation, like a slow-burning fuse, ignited within the hearts of the peasantry. They started to question the very foundations of their world. From the shadows emerged voices of dissent. John Ball, a Lollard priest, roamed the countryside, preaching a radical message of equality. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He cried, challenging the very notion of social hierarchy. And in Kent, a man named Wat Tyler, a blacksmith by trade, rose to prominence. He was a leader, a fighter, a man of the people. He saw the suffering, felt the injustice, and knew that words alone would not suffice. The time for action had come. From the fields and villages, they came, the dispossessed, the downtrodden, the forgotten. Armed with whatever they could find, scythes, pitchforks, axes, they gathered, ready to challenge the authority that had oppressed them for so long. The spark ignited. Manor houses were attacked, records of feudal obligations burned, symbols of authority destroyed. The peasants, once meek and subservient, now roared with a collective rage that shook the foundations of the land. They marched, liberating imprisoned serfs, tearing down the symbols of their oppression. Their numbers swelled with each passing day, a tidal wave of discontent sweeping across the countryside, aimed at the heart of the kingdom, London. News of the uprising reached London, throwing the court into disarray. King Richard II, a mere boy of 14, and his advisors struggled to comprehend the scale of the crisis. The peasants were coming, and the city was unprepared. The stage was set. The seeds of discontent had been sown, watered by oppression, and now they were about to bloom into a bloody harvest. The harrowing of London was about to begin. The relentless sun beat down upon Essex, baking the fields dry. Another year, another struggle. The shadow of the Black Death still lingered, not in the numbers of the dead, but in the scarcity of labor and the increased burdens placed upon those who remained. Then came the tax collectors. Thomas Bampton, a tax collector in Essex. His unfair practices sparked local unrest that then spread. He was a man whose belly strained against his ill-fitting finery, a man whose eyes darted from face to face, calculating profit and assessing threat. The third poll tax, a crushing weight on already bowed backs, was his mandate, and he executed it with ruthless efficiency. In Brentwood, whispers turned to murmurs and murmurs to angry complaints. The tax was levied on every person over the age of 15, regardless of their ability to pay. Families were forced to sell their few possessions, their livestock, even the tools they needed to survive. Bampton's methods were brutal. He levied exorbitant fines for the slightest infraction, real or imagined. He seized property without warning and threatened imprisonment for those who dared to question his authority. Resentment simmered, a slow-burning fire beneath the surface of obedience. The spark ignited. A stone thrown, a curse uttered, a shove turned violent. The simmering resentment boiled over in a small act of defiance, a desperate attempt to strike back against the injustice that threatened to consume them. From the chaos, a figure emerged. Wat Tyler is a 34-year-old man, the leader of the revolt. He has short, roughly cut dark brown hair, steely gray eyes, and a weathered, tanned skin tone. He's of a wiry, muscular build, standing approximately 58. His most distinctive feature is a jagged scar across his left cheek. He typically wears a simple tunic of coarse wool, patched leather breeches, and sturdy leather boots, carrying a blacksmith's hammer as his symbol of authority. A blacksmith by trade, he possessed a natural charisma and an unwavering sense of justice. He had seen enough, and he would not stand idly by while his neighbors were robbed of their livelihoods. Tyler's words resonated with the people of Brentwood. They gathered around him, armed with whatever tools they could find: pitchforks, axes, rusty swords, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. They would resist. They would fight for their rights. With Tyler at their head, the villagers marched on Brentwood. They were a ragtag army, but they were united in their purpose. They would not be intimidated. They would not be silenced. Bampton, caught unawares, fled in terror. His guards, outnumbered and overwhelmed, scattered before the advancing mob. The tax collector's reign of terror had come to an abrupt end. The tax records were seized and burned in the town square, a symbolic act of defiance against the oppressive regime. The villagers cheered, their voices filled with a newfound sense of hope and empowerment. News of the uprising in Brentwood spread like wildfire throughout Essex. Villagers from neighboring towns, inspired by their example, flocked to Tyler's banner. The spark of rebellion had ignited a flame that threatened to engulf the entire country. The authorities in London, initially dismissive of the unrest in Essex, began to realize the gravity of the situation. Reports flooded in of growing rebellion, of villages rising up in defiance of the crown. A storm was brewing, and the kingdom trembled. The seeds of rebellion were not sown solely in the fields of Essex and Kent. A different kind of plowman, one who tilled the soil of men's minds, was at work. His name was John Ball, a Lollard priest, and his words were as potent as any weapon. John Ball was more than a priest. He was a revolutionary. He belonged to the Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe, who challenged the authority of the church and preached that the Bible should be accessible to all in their own language. Their ideas, though whispered in secret, resonated deeply with the common folk. Ball preached a radical message. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He argued that all men were created equal, and that the social hierarchy was a man-made construct designed to oppress the poor. His words were like a balm to the wounded souls of the peasantry. He spoke of a time when there would be no lords or serfs, when all men would be free and equal. He condemned the greed and corruption of the church and the nobility, accusing them of exploiting the poor for their own gain. His message was one of hope and liberation, but also of defiance and rebellion. Ball's sermon spread like wildfire throughout the countryside. Messengers carried his words from village to village, igniting the hearts of the downtrodden. His influence grew, and with it, the fear of the authorities. The voices of dissent did not go unnoticed. Thomas Bampton, ever vigilant in his pursuit of taxes, reported Ball's seditious preachings to the authorities. One day, as Ball preached in a village square, royal guards descended upon him. He was arrested and imprisoned, accused of heresy and sedition. Locked away in Maidstone prison, Ball's voice was silenced, or so the authorities believed, but they were wrong. Imprisonment only amplified his message. News of Ball's arrest spread like wildfire. For Wat Tyler and his fellow rebels, it was the final straw. The injustice of it fueled their resolve. Though imprisoned, Ball's words continued to resonate. His followers, emboldened by his teachings, prepared to act. The cry for freedom echoed across the land. Wat Tyler, a blacksmith with fire in his heart, saw in Ball's imprisonment not defeat, but a call to arms. He rallied the men of Kent, urging them to march on London and demand justice. And so the March on London began, fueled by the injustice of the poll tax, the oppression of the lords, and the inspiring words of John Ball, the voice of the people, silenced but not forgotten. The embers of rebellion, fanned by Thomas Bampton's heavy-handed tax collection in Essex, quickly spread across the Thames into Kent. What began as localized outrage transformed into a widespread conflagration of peasant discontent, fueled by years of oppression and unfulfilled promises. In Kent, a natural leader emerged. Wat Tyler, a man forged in the fires of hardship, possessed the charisma and strategic mind to unite the disparate bands of rebels. He was no mere rabble-rouser. He was a blacksmith, a man of the people, understanding both the forge and the field. Tyler, with a core group of seasoned men, began to organize the peasants into a cohesive fighting force. He drilled them in basic formations, taught them how to use their tools as weapons, and instilled in them a sense of discipline and purpose. Every village contributed men and supplies. As Tyler organized the armed rebellion, John Ball, the radical Lollard priest, provided the ideological fire. His sermons, once whispered in secret gatherings, now rang out openly across the countryside. He preached of equality, of a world without lords and serfs, of a time when all men would be free. The rebels, emboldened by Tyler's leadership and Ball's message, began to take direct action. Rochester Castle was one of the first targets. The peasants demanded the surrender of a suspected traitor to their cause. The rebels directed their ire towards symbols of authority. Manorial records, the instruments of their enslavement, were seized and burned in village squares. Tax collectors, like Thomas Bampton, who started the revolt, became targets of popular fury. The destruction of manorial records was not merely an act of vandalism. It was a symbolic rejection of the feudal system itself. By destroying the records of their servitude, the peasants were declaring their freedom. Prisons were stormed, and serfs unjustly imprisoned were liberated. These acts of defiance sent a clear message to the ruling class. The peasants would no longer tolerate oppression. Tyler addressed his growing army, his voice ringing with conviction. He laid out their demands: the abolition of serfdom, the freedom to buy and sell goods, a fair rent for land, and a general pardon for all involved in the uprising. John Ball walked alongside the marching peasants, chanting biblical verses and revolutionary slogans. He reminded them that they were not merely rebels but agents of God, chosen to cleanse the land of injustice. As the rebels marched towards London, King Richard II, barely more than a boy, watched from the tower. the smoke of burning manor houses painting a grim picture on the horizon. He knew that the very foundations of his kingdom were under threat. The storm was gathering. The peasants' revolt, born of desperation and fueled by a thirst for justice, was about to break upon the gates of London. The world would never be the same. The march on London began not with a roar but with a rumble. From the fields and villages of Kent, the peasants gathered, drawn by Wat Tyler's call for freedom. Each step was a defiance, each gathering a surge of hope. John Ball, the firebrand preacher, walked among them, his words stoking the flames of rebellion. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His question echoed in their hearts, a challenge to the very foundations of their world. Their army was unlike any England had seen. Pitchforks became spears, scythes turned into glaives. Hammers, axes, and clubs were wielded with the grim determination of men who had nothing left to lose. At each village, each manor, the rebels faced resistance, but their numbers were their strength. Some local guards stood their ground, some turned and fled. The people joined the march. Manorial records, symbols of their bondage, were torn and burned. The peasants destroyed the documents that bound them to the land, the shackles of feudalism crumbling in the flames. Jails were thrown open, releasing those imprisoned for debt or petty crimes. These freed men and women swelled the ranks of the rebellion, adding to the unstoppable tide. Word spread like wildfire. From every corner of Kent and Essex, men and women abandoned their fields and homes to join the march. The roads to London became rivers of humanity, flowing towards the heart of the kingdom. Villages offered what little they had: bread, cheese, ale, some out of fear, others out of solidarity. The rebellion was no longer just a march. It was a movement, a wave of popular support. News of the growing rebellion reached the ears of young King Richard. Fear gripped the royal court as the magnitude of the uprising became terrifyingly clear. Thomas Bampton, the spark that ignited the flame, hid in fear. The weight of his ill-gotten gains a heavy burden on his conscience. As they approached London, the sheer scale of the rebellion became undeniable. The fields around the city were filled with a sea of tents and makeshift shelters, a testament to the peasants' unwavering resolve. Wat Tyler, his eyes fixed on the city, knew that the real battle was about to begin. London, the heart of the kingdom, stood before them, a prize to be won or a grave to be shared. The vanguard of the peasant army crested the final hill overlooking London. Before them lay the city, a sprawling mass of stone and timber, its spires and towers piercing the sky like accusing fingers. For weeks they had marched, bled, and burned, fueled by a hunger for justice and a burning hatred for the injustices that had ground them down. Now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Within the Tower of London, panic began to grip the royal court. Messengers, breathless and disheveled, arrived in a constant stream, each bearing increasingly alarming reports of the rebels' approach. Young King Richard, barely a man, struggled to maintain composure as his advisors debated wildly, their voices filled with fear and recrimination. The city gates, usually bustling with commerce and activity, were now sealed shut, guarded by a meager force of soldiers. Most of the city's trained men were away, fighting in France, leaving London vulnerable. Behind the gates, the mood was one of fearful anticipation. Many citizens, burdened by the same taxes and resentments as the rebels, secretly sympathized with their cause. Wat Tyler, his voice echoing across the open fields, addressed the city. He spoke not of plunder or destruction, but of justice and freedom. He demanded entry to London, not as conquerors, but as fellow Englishmen seeking redress for their grievances. His words, carried on the wind, found fertile ground in the hearts of the city's discontented. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the gates of London swung open, not by force but by treachery. A group of sympathetic citizens, risking their lives, had secretly opened a side gate, allowing a small contingent of rebels to slip inside. The city was breached. As the rebel army poured into London, anarchy descended upon the city. John Ball, the fiery preacher, seized the opportunity to spread his radical message. In Cheapside, he preached of a world without lords or serfs, a world where all men were equal in the eyes of God. His words fueled the flames of rebellion, turning resentment into righteous fury. The first target was the Savoy Palace, the opulent residence of John of Gaunt, the hated uncle of the king. The rebels, fueled by years of resentment, stormed the palace, looting its treasures and setting it ablaze. The flames, visible for miles, signaled the complete breakdown of order. Next, the rebels turned their wrath upon the temple, the center of legal administration. They ransacked the buildings, destroying court records and legal documents, symbolizing their rejection of the established legal system. The streets were littered with parchment and burning debris. Some of the rebels sought out specific individuals. Thomas Bampton, the tax collector whose heavy-handed methods had sparked the revolt in Essex, was dragged through the streets, his cries for mercy drowned out by the jeers of the mob. Justice, however brutal, was being meted out in the streets of London. From the Tower of London, young King Richard watched helplessly as his capital burned. The cries of the mob, the crackling of flames, and the stench of smoke filled the air. He was king in name only, a powerless figurehead in the face of the storm. The rebels, emboldened by their success, stormed the Tower of London. They sought out Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the Lord Chancellor, and Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer, two of the most hated figures in the government. They were dragged from their refuge and condemned to a swift and brutal execution. The heads of Sudbury and Hales, displayed on pikes above the tower, served as a grim warning to the ruling class. The rebels had tasted power, and they were not about to relinquish it easily. London was in their grip, and the king himself was at their mercy. The gates of the Tower of London breached. The rebels, a human tide, surged through, seeking those they deemed enemies of the people. Wat Tyler, their leader, stood as a beacon of their fury, his hammer a symbol of their newfound power. Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, sought sanctuary in the Tower's chapel, his prayers a desperate plea against the storm raging outside. But stone walls offer little protection against the wrath of a people betrayed. The mob, led by Tyler, seized Sudbury, their faces contorted with rage. He was dragged, stumbling, from the sanctuary he sought, his pleas drowned out by the baying of the crowd, in London during the summer of 1381. Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer, met a similar fate. Dragged from his hiding place, his wealth and status offered no shield against the people's fury, in London during the summer of 1381. On Tower Hill, a makeshift execution block was erected. Before it, Sudbury and Hales knelt, their fate sealed. The axe fell, a brutal punctuation mark on years of perceived injustice, in London during the summer of 1381. London descended into chaos. The streets, once orderly, became avenues of destruction. Flames licked at timbered houses, shops were ransacked, and the air filled with the screams of the terrified and the triumphant shouts of the rebels, in London during the summer of 1381. Within the Tower, young King Richard and his advisors huddled, fear gripping their hearts. The city outside was no longer theirs. It belonged to the mob, to the peasants who had come to demand their due in London during the summer of 1381. The wealthy elite, who had long enjoyed lives of privilege, now scrambled to escape the city, their finery replaced by rags, their arrogance by terror. The streets, once symbols of their power, had become pathways to their potential doom in London during the summer of 1381. In Maidstone prison, the doors swung open. John Ball, the firebrand preacher, was freed. His release was a spark to the powder keg, his words about to fan the flames of revolution higher in London during the summer of 1381. The mob, led by Tyler, seized Sudbury, their faces contorted with rage. He was dragged, stumbling, from the sanctuary he sought, his pleas drowned out by the baying of the crowd. Tyler and Ball, the muscle and the mind of the rebellion, conferred. Their aims were aligned, a new England free from the shackles of oppression. But the path to that freedom was paved with blood and fire in London during the summer of 1381. As dusk settled over London, the fires continued to burn. The city, once a symbol of royal power, was now a testament to the fury of the oppressed. The harrowing of London had begun, its end yet to be written, in London during the summer of 1381. The air at Mile End crackled with anticipation. King Richard II, barely a man, stood before the assembled rebels. He was about to play the most crucial hand of his young reign, a gambit that could either save his crown or shatter it completely. Wat Tyler, his scarred face grim, listened as Richard, in a clear, strong voice that belied his age, addressed the crowd. He spoke of grievances, of justice, and of the king's desire to right the wrongs that had been inflicted upon the common man. With a flourish, Richard presented the charters, documents granting freedom from serfdom, the right to fair rents, and pardons for their actions during the revolt. A collective murmur rippled through the assembled peasants. A wave of jubilation washed over the crowd. They had won, or so they believed. The charters, symbols of their hard-fought victory, were clutched tightly in calloused hands. Wat Tyler, however, remained cautious. He watched as the bulk of the rebel army, satisfied with the king's concessions, began to disperse, heading back to their villages, their homes. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. In the Tower of London, Richard met in secret with his advisers. The charters, he declared, were merely a means to an end. Once the rebels were dispersed, the concessions would be revoked. Justice, royal justice, would be served. John Ball, ever the radical, continued to preach, urging those who remained to press their demands further. He saw the charters as a temporary reprieve, not a lasting solution. The lords will never willingly relinquish their power, he warned. Doubt began to creep into the minds of those who had initially rejoiced. The king's promises seemed too good to be true. Whispers of betrayal and broken oaths filled the air. Tyler, fueled by Ball's warnings and his own suspicions, rallied those who remained. "We have only tasted freedom," he declared. "We must secure it for ourselves and for generations to come." Richard, observing the continued unrest, realized that his gambit was not yet complete. Tyler and Ball remained a threat, a spark that could reignite the flames of rebellion. He needed to act decisively. News of the king's secret intentions began to spread like wildfire. The charters, it was whispered, were worthless scraps of parchment. The promised freedoms, a cruel jest. Wat Tyler knew what he had to do. The king's word could not be trusted. He would meet with Richard again, this time at Smithfield. and this time he would not leave until he had secured true and lasting justice for the people of England. Smithfield, a vast, open space just outside the city walls, now teeming with armed peasants. The air hung thick with tension as King Richard II, a boy barely into his teens, prepared to meet with Wat Tyler and the rebel host once more. Tyler approached the king, his eyes narrowed, his hand never straying far from the hammer at his side. The demands he voiced were the same as before, yet the tone was different, harsher, more insistent. John Ball stood silently amongst the throng, his eyes burning with religious fervor. He watched the proceedings with an intensity that belied his age, a silent testament to the righteousness of their cause. Richard, despite his youth, attempted to maintain a semblance of control. He listened, he questioned, he even conceded where he could, hoping to diffuse the volatile situation. But Tyler's patience wore thin. He grew more demanding, his language more coarse. He called for the complete abolishment of serfdom, for the redistribution of church lands, for a world turned upside down. William Walworth, the mayor of London, stood a short distance away, his unease growing with each passing moment. He sensed the precariousness of the situation, the simmering tension that threatened to erupt into violence. Suddenly, Tyler made a move. Whether it was an attempt to seize the king or merely a gesture of defiance, the intent was unclear, but it was enough. Walworth reacted instantly. He drew his sword and struck Tyler down. The blow was swift and brutal, ending Tyler's life in a single, decisive moment. Tyler crumpled to the ground, the life draining from his eyes. The hammer, the symbol of his authority, lay discarded beside him. A roar erupted from the peasant ranks. They surged forward, a wave of rage threatening to engulf the king and his party. The revolt teetered on the brink of utter chaos. Then something unexpected happened. Richard, the boy king, rode forward alone and unarmed. His voice, surprisingly strong, cut through the din. "I am your captain," he cried, "follow me." The rebels hesitated. Confused, leaderless, they looked to the boy king, who, in that moment, became the unlikely savior of the crown. The tide had turned, but the reckoning was yet to come. With Wat Tyler fallen, King Richard, young as he was, seized the moment. He rode forward, his voice ringing across Smithfield. "Sirs," he declared, "will you kill your king? I am your leader. Follow me." The crowd, stunned and leaderless, began to waver. The king, against all odds, had turned the tide, promising charters of freedom and pardons for their actions. A fragile peace settled over the field, bought with words and the promise of a better future. The peasants, weary and disillusioned by Tyler's death, began to disperse. They laid down their scythes and hammers, their hearts heavy with uncertainty. The king's guard, emboldened by the sudden shift in power, watched them closely, their hands never far from their swords. The revolt, it seemed, was over, quelled not by force, but by a young king's cunning words. Back within the walls of the tower, Richard II met with his advisers. The relief of Smithfield was quickly replaced by the grim reality of governance. The promises made had to be considered, and the long-term implications weighed. Some advisers argued for harsh retribution, others for measured reform. The king listened, his young face betraying the weight of his responsibility. The king's peace did not extend to all. John Ball, the firebrand preacher who had ignited the hearts of the rebels with his message of equality, was arrested. His capture was swift and brutal, his fiery words silenced by the cold hand of royal authority. He was dragged through the streets of London, a stark reminder of the fate that awaited those who dared to challenge the established order. John Ball was quickly brought to trial. Accused of sedition and heresy, he stood before his judges, his spirit unbroken. He defended his beliefs, reiterating his message of social justice and equality before God. His words, though now spoken in chains, still resonated with the power of truth, challenging the very foundations of feudal society. John Ball was condemned to death. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered in St. Albans, a gruesome spectacle meant to deter any future rebellion. But even in death, his words lingered in the minds of the people, a seed planted that would one day blossom into a demand for greater freedom and justice. The king, secure in his restored authority, began to systematically dismantle the promises he had made. The charters of freedom granted at Mile End were revoked. Pardons were withdrawn. The rebels were hunted down and punished. The old order, seemingly threatened for a brief moment, was brutally re-established. The peasants returned to their villages, their dreams of freedom dashed. The fields they had left in rebellion now awaited their labor. The manorial lords, emboldened by the king's actions, tightened their grip on the land and its people. Life, it seemed, had returned to normal, but the memory of the revolt lingered, a smoldering ember beneath the ashes of defeat. Yet the peasants' revolt was not without its lasting impact. The chroniclers of the time, though often biased towards the ruling class, recorded the events of that tumultuous summer. They documented the grievances of the peasantry, the brutality of the suppression, and the seeds of change that had been sown. Over the decades that followed, the feudal system began to weaken. The demand for labor, exacerbated by the Black Death, gave the peasantry greater bargaining power. Serfdom gradually declined, replaced by a system of wage labor. The memory of the revolt, though suppressed, inspired future generations to demand better treatment and greater freedom. In the taverns and fields, the stories of Wat Tyler and John Ball were whispered. Their names became symbols of resistance against injustice. The revolt, though ultimately unsuccessful in its immediate goals, became a powerful reminder that even the most downtrodden could rise up and challenge the established order. Today, the peasants' revolt stands as a pivotal moment in English history. It serves as a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and justice. Though the immediate gains were limited, the revolt planted the seeds of social change that would eventually blossom into a more equitable society. The harrowing of London, though suppressed, echoed through the centuries, a reminder that the voice of the people, however faint, can never be truly silenced.